Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Open Source podcast, which is an evolution of the OpenStack and Beyond podcast. Today is Wednesday, April 12th. My name is Jeremy Hess, Community Manager at Cloudify, and I'm joined by Cloudify's CTO, Nati Shalom, and Director of Product Management, Arthur Berezin. Today we'll be chatting with Phil Robb, Vice President of Operations in Networking and Orchestration for the Linux Foundation and Executive Director of OpenDaylight, and Armando Migliaccio, Distinguished Engineer at SUSE. Phil, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then Armando, you can introduce yourself.
So, as Jeremy said, Phil Robb. I've been working at the Linux Foundation for about 4 years now, leading the technical community for OpenDaylight, and now more broadly across all of the networking projects that are at the Linux Foundation. And most recently, spending significant time in getting the ONAP community up and running.
Hi, everyone. My name is Armando. I am at SUSE right now. Been working on OpenStack pretty much since the inception, going from the most recent experience to the old ones. I've been heavily involved in the networking community within the OpenStack ecosystem. I've led the Neutron team for the past 3 releases, Mitaka, Newton, and Okata. And I've been on the development side and the day-to-day operations of running the OpenStack Neutron community for the past 3 or 4 years. I started working on Nova and doing some operation work and over time, and then yes, most recently I joined SUSE through HPE, where I was again leading the open source networking efforts. And also looking at sister communities, OpenStack sister communities like OpenDaylight, OpenVSwitch, and so on, OpenNFV.
So the title of the podcast is really about ONS and ONAP. We're going to focus on this podcast mostly on ONAP, but I want to start with a quick impression from both of you, including, well, actually, Arthur, fill in, because you've been in the event as well, about the impression about the event, what's been the main highlights, what's your key takeaways. So I'll start with you, Phil.
Sure. So I was quite happy with the Open Networking Summit this year. The Linux Foundation took it over 2 years ago, so this was our 2nd year, and we're really trying to evolve the show into something that is very business and user focused of what are the most important open technologies in networking. As you know, the telecommunications industry and the data networking industries are going through substantial change. And a lot of that is driven through these open source projects that are really, building the foundation from which a lot of solutions over the next decade are going to be based. So trying to have a solid event with really solid content and a place where lots of people would come, because the content kind of gets them there. But to be honest, often the most interesting things that happen at these types of conferences is the hallway track, as it is known, which is, again, people meeting, talking and advancing whatever technologies they are most passionate about. We had, I was on the program committee for ONS, and we had a lot of submissions. We had around 250 or so submissions, to which we had like 55 sessions. So just an outstanding collection of topics and speakers to draw from. So in general, I was very happy. And then of course, lots of information and buzz around ONAP as the most recent open source platform that really should make a significant impact on the telecommunications industry.
Yeah, it sounds like networking is becoming cool again. I mean, it's been almost the orphan child in the cloud stack, if you like, for a while, and all of a sudden there is a very big buzz around many new 3 letters, actually 4 letters. We encounter ONAP as well. How do you explain that, Phil?
Well, I think a lot of it actually has to do with 5G in particular. We have a significant change in the way our telecommunications infrastructure needs to be run to support both the bandwidth requirements, the amount of content that's being put out, as well as the number of devices that are going to be leveraged. And we've watched open source be a key driver for significantly improving the speed with which innovation can come out. And we've watched over the last 4 years the telecommunications industry and the networking industry at large really grab a hold of that. And it's evidenced by the projects that you see, and now the significant effort of integrating those projects to continue to be very efficient at getting that innovation out as quickly as possible. So it's really, in the end, it's customer demand, right? 5G, the amount of video traffic, the support for IoT, and all of what that entails is a whole different paradigm for how networks are actually deployed and managed, and it's got to be a lot more automated than it has been in the past. And that's what these platforms promise is that level of automation.
Excellent, Armando. You've been in the event, and they've been in other big events in OpenStack and others, I assume. Why don't you give your take about the event?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to echo what Phil just said. I mean, the level of content provided at the conference, the excellent quality of the keynotes, it was astounding. I mean, I end up perceiving how well organized or how effective you can gain knowledge out of a conference when you look at your schedule and you realize that you may need to split yourself into 5 different sessions at any given time in order for you to learn as much as you can. And this time for me it was particularly challenging because I really couldn't figure out which session to miss. Also, the fact that ONS in the past 2 iterations, as happened in the Bay Area, it does help the networking factor. It helps get people together. There may be other events that may happen in the Bay Area during the conference time, and they can amplify the opportunities that can of getting folks together, brainstorm, share ideas, and again innovate effectively. However, innovation, doesn't happen by itself. There is an awful, great deal of machine work that has to happen, behind the curtains, so that everything goes smoothly. And I've seen that being very effectively managed by the Linux Foundation, the OpenStack Foundations across the events that I've attended over the years, and it is quite astounding to see how at the core of this you got open source, which is supposed to be again free and openly accessible. So I'd say that this is a great era for developers to be developers effectively. And I'm obviously talking about myself from a technical standpoint. It's a great moment to jump in this industry and transform the industry through this innovation that's taking place in the networking space. You mentioned at the beginning, yes, networking is usually the ones that either is still neglected or blamed. It is intrinsically a difficult thing. There are many moving parts that need to come together in order to fulfill a particular goal. And with everything that's happening, I can see that we're not quite there yet, but I can see that at some point we'll get to where networking will be the shining star of anything that pertains data center and data center technologies.
Excellent. We'll end this round of impression from the event itself with Arthur, who's been there. Arthur, what's your impression from the event?
Sure, yeah. So the biggest thing from my perspective is obviously, the announcement of ONAP and, seeing all the traction around ONAP and the attention ONAP is getting. Obviously, this is major news for all the major telecom operators. I do agree with Phil that, 5G is a major driver for, for us as a community of open source developers, coming and joining together and forming this foundation in order to build, a suitable solution for this space. But in addition to this, also I noticed very interesting dissonance between companies such as Google, who is a major software house developing whatever they need internally in order to solve their own internal problems. Obviously this includes the SDN space as well. Yeah, so seeing the Google's keynote announcing Espresso, their latest stage of enabling SDN right to the client, accessing their internal infrastructure. Now, having seeing this from actual one software house developing his own solutions, and from the other side, seeing the announcement of free range routing project, which is a new open source Linux Foundation project, being formed in order to enable the standard de facto implementation software stack that other guys can use as is without the need of developing such projects internally, being announced and formed and then taking shape as well. So it's very interesting progress that we're seeing in the open source community developing networking related solutions, so all of us can essentially consume them and make use of them as a commodity software. So that's really exciting times for networking from my perspective.
Yeah, thanks very much. It does, I think, sounds like, again, the networking is not just becoming cool again, it's actually the imagination of what you could do with that, especially in the context of IoT on one hand, and also cybersecurity on the other hand. That's kind of mind-blowing. Armando, you've been involved in other communities. Obviously, you're now part of SUSE, which is kind of been involved in the Linux kind of project, but also heavily invested in OpenStack. How do you see the lessons from those projects applied into ONAP? What do you think ONAP should learn from those projects?
Yeah. Okay. So there are a couple of things that that one can look at from the standpoint of running an open source community. And there is the day-to-day operations that have to obviously run smoothly, making sure that developers are effective, are productive, are well coordinated. And that can happen through a number of tools and processes, and then there is the actual events that have to take place, so that then you may end up leveraging the high level bandwidth interactions across across people, so that once they get and distribute themselves across the globe, they can continue being effective. And I think that overall, my personal opinion is that OpenStack has somewhat really nailed down that process of the community. Itself is still going through lots of steps throughout its own journey. For instance, we ended up splitting the usual OpenStack Design Summit into the conference itself and the project team gatherings. And even the day-to-day operations that there is some ongoing transformation as to how things are organized from a development standpoint. And I've seen that other communities like OpenDaylight, OpenFV, OpenVSwitch, they end up like trying to mirror the good things, right, that OpenStack has experimented over the years, and trying to obviously learn from the bad things that have happened as well, and try not to make the same mistakes. So I believe that, you know, OpenStack, even though, for instance, at this open networking summit, I haven't seen a great deal of like talks or hype about OpenStack. I think it's, you know, it's still like embedded in, you know, in the fabric of how these communities, the developers around it, you know, it is basically the community that you can look up to as a place to, you know, learn and apply concept to, you know, to a new community that you may be involved in, like, you know, like the ONAP one.
One question on that regard. I mean, one of the things that I at least have experience with OpenStack is that it's been highly community-led, which also led to a point in which there was, you know, many direction, many opinions of people driving into places, and there was you know, lack of in a way a clear leadership who's actually making the core decision. And then I see that ONAP is actually taking a different, completely different governance model, in which it's almost you know, some would say it's an autocracy kind of model. In which you see you know, clear contributor. Obviously, there is a lot of seed code coming from two main carriers that are involved in that. The PTLs are coming from the carriers themselves, and now there is an expectations from others to join. It's a different style of community in that regard. Maybe you could comment about that.
Yeah, and you know, that goes back to, I mean, you're kind of like double clicked on what I'm, you know, what I was you know, implicitly referring to about the, you know, the good things that, again, you can borrow from the OpenStack community versus like the bad things. I mean, but again, every single aspect can be looked from, you know, from either perspective. At the end of the day, it is true that OpenStack has grown somewhat organically over the years. You know, at the very inception of the project, you only had like two tiny code bases. Well, not so tiny, but, you know, Nova and Swift that came together, and then there was a proliferation of like a lot smaller projects that were either carved out of the existing projects, so like completely new. So think about, you know, Neutron, Cinder, Heat, you know, Magnum, and blah blah blah. I mean, I could go for hours to go over all the OpenStack projects that have been you know, defined over the years. And then even the you know, the strong presence of the technical committee is kind of like matured over the most recent years versus like the very beginning of the project. So there is some good into how OpenStack has evolved. On the other end, it's for people who may not necessarily like thrive in chaos, and they like you know, they like a top-down approach to tackling technical challenges, then it may be somewhat problematic. On the other end, though, you got to counterbalance the fact that if you're taking a top-down driven approach, you may end up like stifling to some degree that organic growth. Because again, folks are a lot more constrained within the boundaries of you know, what technical directions the steering committee may decide for the project. So, and also when communities come up to existence out of the contribution of a massive code base, they may also create friction and problems for newcomers, because there's a lot smaller opportunity for individual contributions, either from, again, people who may be affiliated to vendors, or, you know, folks that may just have spare time in their evenings and, you know, just have a tendency of learning about new things, like, you know, how to deal with the new 5G evolution wave that's coming to reality. So again, my opinion is that you gotta look at each and every single aspect from either side of the fence, and ultimately there is not really like a straight answer, and the success of the community overall is determined not, it takes time for really to see how the community can end up getting to a steady state and operate as an organic entity over time. Obviously, ONAP is just started coming from eComp and OpenO. They themselves are like still young initiatives. When you look at OpenStack, it's been nearly 7 years that's ongoing, and we're still kind of like figuring it out how to operate effectively. So it's, I would say that the jury is still out, to be honest.
Sure. So Phil, I'm kind of sensing almost your energy to answer that type of question coming from the Linux Foundations and your experience with OpenDaylight specifically. Maybe you could comment about the, how do you draw the balance between openness and governance, and based on your experience in OpenDaylight, based on the structure that the Linux Foundation took with ONAP? Phil?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and yes, I apparently was chomping at the bit behind the microphone. Because to be honest, for me, that's why I do this. That's really the fun part of the job. A little bit more background on me. I actually started working in open source in 2001 in the Linux environment, actually for Hewlett-Packard, and led their open source program office, and actually left in 2013 to start OpenDaylight. But during that time also, I was part of the original bylaw committee for OpenStack, and led a lot of the HP OpenStack activities in the early days, actually before I believe Armando got there. But regardless, so I've watched, and indeed we work very hard to learn from one community to the next. Leverage what's good, learn from what didn't work so well. And OpenStack in many ways is an anomaly. Talk about energy when that project kicked off in 2010. Two code bases came together, and indeed, I mean, Rackspace as one of the leading contributors there, they used to make a point when they would do their keynote at the OpenStack's summits, talk about how much code and what was the committer ratio of Rackspace to the rest of the community, because they wanted that number to go down, right? Making a level playing field, removing barriers to entry for new individuals are key tenets of building a community that developers and organizations can get around, right? Making an environment where, if you come to that ecosystem and you want to get something done and you're willing to put resources to make whatever it is you're looking to add to that platform for your needs, and you feel you can get that done in the community, then you come. Right, and that's a key tenet, that you have to have a level playing field, the ability for whoever comes to actually get what they're looking to get done, counterbalanced with, what is the overall architecture? What are the most important priorities for the project overall? Is that clearly understood and agreed to by the different constituents? ONAP's one of ONAP's first interesting questions that it will have to answer is, there are already organizations and industries that are looking at this orchestration and automation platform and going, that actually could be something very interesting for us, and they have nothing to do with telecommunications. So they're clearly going to go off in different directions as to what they need from such a platform, and that will deviate from the core needs of the telecommunications industry. How will that be balanced? What will the community do in that place? And those are questions that are yet to be seen. The Linux Foundation, and my job in particular, is to make sure that is a level playing field, make sure that, again, everything we do in the technical community is transparent, again, as welcoming as we can possibly make it, putting structure around that decision-making process that fits the project, and that is different based on who's really engaging in the project. Is it a bunch of users? Is it a bunch of vendors? If it's just vendors, how do you get the user input? The ONAP community has already talked about creating a product group, highly leveraging a concept out of OpenStack in particular, with a forum for the product managers and those that are actually looking to release their software into operations in these large telecommunications providers, having them be able to provide input on the priorities and the importance of different aspects of the community development. And then yes, we have the bringing together of two significant code bases with some original work and a proposal on what that might look like from two of the leading carriers, AT&T and China Mobile. But that's a discussion that is to be had within the community, and it's one that is just starting now. I think Armando touched upon also just getting developers together and how important that is. And I totally agree, particularly when a project is new, and particularly when a reasonable number of the participants in that project are new to open source, because it's a different world, right? As we all know, because we've been doing open source for so long, the model is not the same as when you're working inside of a company, or even when you're working across companies, but you have NDAs and partnership agreements and all of the other contractual stuff that you typically have if you're going to work with a partner on some project. Open source is different. It is a social organization, right? Your credibility, your reputation is based on both what you do, in the code, as well as your interactions with the other community members, and creating a place and a way for those individuals to get together, have those face-to-face meetings, get to know one another personally. That definitely speeds up the development activities and reduces friction across the environment as a whole.
So one thing on that regard, in terms of at least one of the most recent, most of the common comment about OpenStack, and that's also a question to Arthur here, is about the developer experience. I mean, obviously, when you look at AT&T and China Mobile, then they want to take something into production. They think about how to solve the complex things. Developers obviously want things to get started easily. Something that would run on their environment that they can actually get from Git and compile and run easily. How do you balance the two? I know that in OpenStack it took a while to figure that out.
Yeah, and it's a good question. I mean, to AT&T's credit, to help developers understand the original code coming from eComp, making something that was very easily, now granted, deployed on Rackspace, right? Their suggestion is to deploy this thing on Rackspace, but to bring up an account and automatically do the install, and it does all the decompressions, and then you can rather quickly run a couple of test example VNFs on that rather massive platform. We actually had folks doing it. We did tutorials on Monday of ONS, and we did hands-on Hackfest type of activity in the afternoon on Monday. And we had folks actually doing exactly that, creating Rackspace accounts, pushing the software over there, doing the decompression of it all, seeing the different components, identifying that they were running correctly, and then running the sample VNFs. And then the next stage is obviously to go make some modifications to those VNFs and their relationship and interaction with the orchestration platform, which is like the next step that then folks go on to beyond that. So you want to create an environment where people can get engaged, they can find their piece of the overall platform that they want to work with and understand. And then it's really about having solid documentation for them to get started on their own, and then a community of folks that are very willing to answer questions on the mailing list so that can get created. So yeah, that's how I see it. And you're right, these platforms do keep getting bigger and bigger, and it's harder and harder to put it on a laptop for something small. But lucky for us, we have new cloud-based platforms that we can leverage.
Yeah, that sounds like a very promising start. And Arthur, you also came from Red Hat, and you had some experience both being a consumer of OpenStack, but also being part of the a distro player. Maybe you can comment about that balance and what should we learn from that.
Sure. So to me, there are three main key pillars about making the platform more accessible to developers and to the rest of the community. So the first is having a very coherent and clear and simple to follow documentation. I believe this is already started as a good, we have a good starting point from that perspective from the community. We have a good initial reference for documentation, and definitely this was also brought up as part of the the first governing board meeting that took place during the ONS event. So obviously that's a main thing that we are targeting to make more simpler, more accessible. So the second thing about making the communities more accessible is the user experience of a developer, and making it very simple to contribute to projects. So first the developer would need to understand the project, understand how he contributes and to which portions he contributes to, and then the process of contributing new code base, making it throughout the CI process of accepting the contribution, making sure it gets into the code base, etc. And the third part of that is, the developer experience of the application developer that's going to be using the platform itself, and running his application on top of the ONAP platform. So that's the third level that we also need to take care of, where application developers need a very simple and easy to use way of onboarding and creating applications to be orchestrated by the ONAP platform. So that's the third part, which we also need to ensure that it's a rather good experience for those developers and those software vendors developing applications that would be used with ONAP as being the automation platform for their environments. So again, it's about documentation, simpler to contribute process, and simple to develop a process to onboard new applications on top of that platform.
Yeah, so the question that, like, if I'm not supposed to be the moderator, but being part of a active part of an OpenStack, I must add my comments into that discussion, which is dear to my heart. I think that if the main problem in those type of projects, community-led projects, is how do you incentivize the community towards creating a better user experience, and there is a tendency in many of those projects that everyone wants to contribute, is that there's going to be one implementation of that. And so what I've seen in OpenStack, for example, is that motivation drives people to actually spawn a lot of new projects. Some of them are, were necessary, some of them were not. So the question is really become, how do you incentivize the community to contribute in the right places, and also be credited for helping the developer experience? Because if you're measured by how many lines of code you've committed, and how many projects, and who is the PTL of that project, and that's kind of the measure of, if you like, success, then what you're going to end up with is more lines of code. Some of them would be the right ones, some of them would be not the right one. If you measured by having, if you're in a land grabbing kind of world in which each one is trying to put a territory around a certain project, versus creating even multiple projects that are competing on the same thing, then you're immediately putting yourself in a point in which that project becomes a bottleneck, like I think it happened with Nova at some point in OpenStack. So the question is also about how do you create incentives that are not just measuring line of codes and who is holding PDL position in certain projects, but how do you actually incentivize them to provide simpler solution with less amount of code, with less amount of projects, with better quality, with better user experience? What would be those measures in your view, Phil? And Armando also fill in on that regard.
Yeah, well, I think it helps significantly to have users be a significant part of the developer base, because they end up being the ones that are actually using the code. When you have a project where there's a significant amount of vendors and they have the ability to lead that, you end up, from my experience, seeing those incentives be a little bit disjoint, again, more around, quantitative measures as opposed to qualitative measures in getting things done. By contrast, when you have a lot of developers that are, a lot of users that are actually part of the development community, and I find this interesting because for the telecommunications industry, this is, I think, the first project where there is significant actual end users that are, out there hiring developers or using, repurposing internal developers that they've had into these open source projects. And it's been a great benefit to the communities. It certainly has been for OpenDaylight, as we've had, in particular, folks from AT&T, as well as CenturyLink, a variety of other end user actually get directly involved. I think that's something that's very helpful. And it's, again, a little bit unique in the networking projects that we've seen to date, as far as being really strongly led by these end users. But the incentive in that balance is you're right, it is always the question. But when users are leading the activity, them getting their day job done is what's most important. And we touched upon that, and that's the other question. The other thing that is coming out that I'm sensing out of both of the governing board of ONAP as well as the technical community is three different audiences that they really want to address, right? And first is obviously, the developers of the platform itself and getting them together and all rowing in the same direction, so to speak, is obviously an important task. Another one is, how does that platform integrate with and accommodate the virtual network function providers, be them internal or be them third party. So having a clear set of both requirements as well as offerings to that VNF ecosystem is another important outreach and activity that will be done by ONAP, and they recognize that. And then the third is actually their own operators. The way these organizations manage their networks today is very, very different than the way they will manage it in an automated and programmatic way of the future, leveraging a tool such as ONAP or OpenO for that community prior to the merger happening. And that's both an educational process as well as a skill set ramp process, as well as back to that usability, having them directly engaged in what's working, what doesn't, where are the risks. Because again, as we've learned time and time again, automation makes mistakes propagate much faster than manual processes. So getting it right is also very important, and that's a third user base, so to speak, or contingent that is a significant stakeholder of this platform as we get it constructed.
Cool. We're kind of running out of time here, so I want to cover a few more topics, and we'll maybe come back to that topic because I'm sure it's dear to the heart of you as well, and I'm sure others have more comments to do, but we have a little bit more ground to cover here. So I want to kind of switch to another topic, and we may wrap up with that point as again. The other topic is really a question that comes often, is the comparison between ONAP and OSM, ONAP and OpenO, ONAP and Nati. Again, I don't want to do kind of a round on each topic because we don't have time, so I'll let Armando maybe pick one of them first, and then we'll do a round. Each one of you can comment about the comparison. So Armando, do you have any preferences to each one of those comparisons?
Well, actually, I'd like to bring up Tagger as an initiative that was formed within the OpenStack boundaries. Sure. That could be perceived as one of the first attempts at tackling the Etsy manual layer. I guess ultimately it all boils down to these communities and open source enables people to experiment, and you'll end up market forces decide who gets to win. Or who gets to gain the biggest mind share within the industry. It's also sometimes these forces may just simply be dictated by what programming language developers prefer, or what programming language promote faster and more agile development, CI and so on and so forth. So there are multiple forces at play here, and obviously OpenO and Ecom are relatively similar in terms of tools and the entire toolkit that they share, versus something like Tiger, right? It's more like OpenStack oriented in terms of technologies that are being applied.
Are you referring specifically to the choice of language between Python and OpenStack and Java?
That is one of them, right? I mean, that's probably the one that stands out across the others. Now, one may argue that maybe a Python developer may be a lot more productive and effective than a Java developer, but again, it depends on who you talk to. Sometimes you may end up being more versatile in Python, but you gotta write a lot more tests, which means that then you gotta have a really bulletproof CI infrastructure that can help you be that effective, versus if you were a Java developer. So it kind of depends, and I guess both Java and Python have thriving communities of developers that can support development of these initiatives. And actually, one point that I wanted to make was in relation to things like the manageability of the platforms. Any platform that one can work on, dealing with rolling upgrades, dealing with with the environment at scale, dealing with aspects like fault tolerance, reliability. Those are things that really must be nailed down up front at the very beginning, at the very inception of the community. And this is something that potentially, again, other communities may learn from, like from OpenStack, where we didn't necessarily give enough priority to those topics up front, where we was all about features. It's sort of it was on the back of my mind, dealing with rolling upgrades and things like that. But again, those things take actually years to mature, even if they're devised at the inception. So, give enough priority and help, put developers in the positions of upstream developers as well as downstream developers, because we don't have to forget about those. Again, developers that do consume the platforms, there are plenty of them, even in the OpenStack community. So, but again, put them in the position of being effective on a day-to-day basis with, with automation, with tooling, with infrastructure that the founders and the supporters of the community have to provide. It's not just human capital; it's also hardware capital that must be invested so that these communities can be successful.
Right. And Arthur, maybe you want to touch on the modeling language. There's two main candidates for that, Tosca and Yang. I know that OpenO was mostly around Tosca and ONAP was mostly around Yang, and now they're merging together. How do you see that evolving?
Sure. So I think, obviously, put into perspective this ONS event to the previous ONS event to 2016. So, I think we as a community made a major progress in terms of understanding of which modeling language and which domain should be used in which language. So, so obviously, last year there were a lot of, interesting debates in terms of should we use Tosca, should we use Yang, should we just do just workflow driven automation, etc. So I think, the community has gained a lot of experience through the OpenO development, where we had, everything being Tosca based from the modeling perspective, but then using the workflows to implement them. But also, you have also the element of Yang being a modeling language, which is widely used for modeling network elements. So I think, we made a lot of progress from a community perspective in terms of how do we use and utilize the best of each of them. And, it looks like we're generally in agreement in terms of that Tosca is really well-defined DSL for doing model-driven or orchestration automation, where we can leverage, very domain-specific languages such as Yang, to control devices, and use workflow-driven automation for very specific task-oriented things we want to implement. So it looks like, we as a community made a major progress, and it looks like we have a lot of work to do in the ONAP community to start actually, implementing these systems that would be driving these notions that I've just mentioned. So it looks like we're really in the early days of development, but we have at least a better understanding of how to best utilize each of them as a community, which is a major thing, from a community building and implementation perspective.
Thanks. Phil, maybe you want to touch on the Etsy and ONAP. I know that there's been a lot of question around that, specifically around also OSM, which is kind of considered to be more affiliated with Etsy.
Right. And yeah, I mean, while you want innovation to be able to flow wherever it can and wherever it needs to, from an open source project standpoint, we've always found that it's better if we can get some significant critical mass together around a single platform. Let folks actually collaborate on getting that done together and done as quickly as possible and as inexpensively as possible, so that the interesting innovation can happen on top of it. Particularly when you have a platform where, again, potentially, an entire VNF ecosystem will be, constructed that ends up being around these platforms. The fewer of them, the better. And we all can remember the days when, there were 14 different manufacturers of Unix hardware, and you had to write your application to every one of those APIs because POSIX never really did it. And in the end, Windows started to win over in the server market until Linux came about and actually helped create that standard API set that application providers could then sit on. So avoiding that fragmentation is important. So, and OSM and the Etsy effort of doing an orchestration platform there, I want to see the communities continue to talk and to see if there's any more coalescing that can be done from these different platforms. I was very happy to see that the negotiations between OpenEComp, which was planning for doing a launch, and the OpenO communities could come together and do that merge of projects and code, because that, again, is just one less platform that the VNF vendors need to worry about. Agree that I think the most important thing that came out of the discussion between Tosca and Yang is not really the particular technology, but the fact that doing this model-driven platform is really key, and the different modeling language, the different DSLs have their place, and I think that's getting resolved relatively well just across those communities as I hear them talk. We'll be doing a lot more of that, I expect, in our first face-to-face meeting that's coming up at the first week of May. But yeah, those are all just getting kicked off and started. And I look forward to continuing to work closely with Etsy and all of the SDOs as far as that goes, as we figure out how best to integrate rapid, iterative, agile type of development feeding into actively the standards process, because both together get us to what we need much more quickly than either do alone.
Yeah, and actually, I think that the fact that the Linux Foundation brought OpenO and eComp together was, in my view, a very big contribution to the industry itself, and a very impressive move, I must say, as an outsider. And watching it from the side, we do need to kind of wrap up, but I wanted to feel maybe a comment about the Java-centric view of the world. Do you see OpenO, ONAP being a Java-centric project? The language would determine everything, or is that going to be kind of a more multi-language type of project?
To be honest, it is yet to be seen. Obviously, a lot of the core code is Java, so there's always going to be a lot of Java developers around. that ecosystem, and therefore they're going to write in Java, I would expect. But certainly it's totally open for whatever the VNF providers want to do, and other extensions. Like most open source communities, we see a variety of tangents and different languages used where they can fit. But I expect the core to continue to be Java for the ONAP platform.
Good. So we need to kind of wrap up here. So I wanted to, for those who are hearing the podcast, for those who hear first time about ONAP and wants to get their hands dirty, if you'd like, with that, I wanted to get them the feeling how real that is in terms of timeline, in terms of availability of code base, and in terms of easiness of contribution. We'll start with Armando, and we'll do the round, and we'll end with Phil. So Armando, then Arthur, and we'll be closing with Phil. Armando.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that you don't get the casual developer looking at checking these communities out. Most of them would be very well versed into these types of frameworks. And my suggestion is to, as an open source developer who again has been heavily involved in various communities like OpenStack, OpenDaylight, and the others, I'd say try to live on IRC as much as you can. Like, try to be present and reachable, and reach out in order to build a social network of developers who may not necessarily be part of may not necessarily have the same affiliation as yours, because ultimately you get to success by means of networking. And it sounds like kind of a cheesy joke, but yeah, in order to do networking, you got a network. So that would be like my tip.
Excellent, Arthur.
Sure, yeah. So all things considered, I think looking into the challenges of any open source, and particularly new open source projects that are coming together. One of the biggest gaps usually we see in these kinds of things is documentation, is and getting our understanding in terms of what does the code base look like, what are the processes in order to participate, in order to contribute to the project, etc. So all things considered, I think we're in a good starting point. We have the wiki available under wiki.onap.org, which does have a lot of very useful information in terms of how does the initial code base looks like, and how to contribute and how to participate. Obviously there's a lot of room for improvement, but I think we're, all things considered, we're in a good initial shape, and we'll be happy to see more and more guys jumping in on board, going to the wiki, going through the information that's already out there, asking questions and participating. I think again, this is an open source community, participation is a major part to that.
Phil, last word.
Yeah, certainly. I will echo what's just been said. Being on the communication channels, IRC, the email lists. There's a discuss list as well as a technical steering committee list. The technical steering committee is still in the middle of figuring out the charter, which ties back to who's going to be coordinating what, and how the TSC works with the rest of the technical community. Again, we're starting with face-to-faces. There's a face-to-face that's happening the first week of May. And there should be a pointer to it off of the wiki for where the registration is. We'll cap the registration if we need to, but the venue holds like a little more than 300 people. So it's a good venue. We can get a large crowd there for our first face-to-face for the technical community. So that's an easy way to get immediately immersed, talking through principles of how you do architecture, the principles of where and how we're going to do the merger of code between OpenO and the eComp code bases. These are all prime discussion topics for this very first face-to-face. So it's going to be a good event. I'm quite confident, and lots of information will be dispelled. We will do our best to record it, but it's one of those where, again, if you're on site, it's going to be a lot better. Slides from the whole mini summit that we just did at ONS are, if they're not on the wiki now, they will be within the next day or two. So we're starting to get, good information, and again, lots of good opportunities coming up soon to participate.
Thanks very much. First of all, a lot of good content and comments here in this call. As we wrapping up here, I just wanted to say my few words here. Been in another project for a couple of years and evangelizing it for quite some time, OpenStack specifically. I think specifically that the user experience is the developer experience more specifically is something that is often neglected at first stages because it's a big project and it's kicking off and you need to fill in a lot of gaps, and you have to deal with those type of things alongside what Amanda mentioned, which is the availability and all the utilities, if you like, which is not too necessarily features. Those are big challenges that in many cases I see projects fail because there is this tendency to do the land grabbing and filling out features and launching projects and this type of dynamics. It would be very, very important for me to see that changing. I think there is a very big opportunity for ONAP to really make a difference here. And I look forward myself to be echoing that message and trying to figure out the right balance there among obviously the big giants there. So that would be at least my voice in this big community. So anyway, thank you very much, Phil, Arthur, Amanda, for joining me for this our discussion. Very interesting discussion. Obviously, there's going to be a lot on that topic coming soon. And as you mentioned, Phil, the May event is the next thing to look for. So thank you all for joining.